Great, thanks, Hannah. I'm delighted to see everybody here and to be involved with Improvement Service in this session. It's really heartening to see so many local elected members keen to be part of this and keen to be part of this discussion. As Hannah says, I'm director of Child Poverty Action Group. Just in case you don't know who we are, we're a national charity. Our entire purpose is to work for an end to child poverty in Scotland, and as part of CPAG UK across the UK. We do that through various strands of activity, raising awareness of that poverty and the impact it has on children and families, identifying evidence-based policy solutions, and then working to inform and influence policymakers and politicians to bring about the changes that are needed to support low-income families. And we've also got particular expertise in the social security system and provide training, advice, information to frontline advisors and other frontline workers in Scotland. In every single local authority area in Scotland, in fact, we're providing information, training, casework support to frontline workers. So as Hannah said, I'm just kind of going to kick off by providing a little bit of context. We currently have a situation where the latest official statistics tell us that 1 in 4 of Scotland's children are officially recognised as living in poverty. That's a poverty line that is less than 70% of the minimum income that the general public actually think is needed for a basic but socially acceptable standard of living. So we're talking about around 250,000 children in Scotland living in families that don't have adequate incomes or resources to provide a decent start in life for the children. Really important point is that 2/3 of those children are living in families where at least one of the adults is working. This is very much about an in-work problem as well as a problem for families where parents aren't able to work. It's a poverty that affects children in every local authority area of Scotland. So we know there are areas with particularly high levels of child poverty, but there's no local authority area in Scotland that has less than 10% of its children living in poverty. It's a poverty that certainly over the last decade has become increasingly not just about a grinding lack of income, inability to make ends meet day to day, but one that's increasingly about acute income crisis, families finding themselves with no money. And the most obvious sign of that is the numbers of families with children who end up needing to use food banks to get food. It's a poverty that has left families brutally exposed to the current situation where soaring inflation is pushing up prices. These were families that had little or nothing to cut back on even before the price of energy and food started to rise so much. It's a poverty that has been rising over the last decade. All the independent analysis suggests that is driven by cuts to the value of child benefit and wider family benefits at UK level, as well as the increasingly precarious nature of too many jobs that parents rely on. I'm going to go on to the next slide. Are we able to go on to the next slide, Hannah? Impact. So it's a poverty. And again, from your experience at local level, you'd be well aware of the impact that this poverty has on children's life chances, their health, their education. Just a couple of examples here in terms of that impact on health. We know that children growing up in the lowest income households almost 4 times as likely to have just fair or bad or very bad health compared to those in better off families, 4 times as likely to have poorer mental well-being as those in higher incomes. We know in terms of education, even before they start school, children growing up in low-income families, by the age of 5, there's a gap of 10 months in problem solving and 13 months in vocabulary development compared to their better off peers. And too often that gap widens as children proceed through school, so that by S2, pupils in areas of low deprivation are twice as likely to be performing well on numeracy than those in high areas of deprivation. So clear impacts at a trend level on the outcomes for children experiencing poverty. But of course, it's not just about that kind of overall level, it's the day-to-day impact on children's lives. And if we look at the next slide, we can just see a few of the voices from some of the children and young people that we've worked with through our Cost of the School Day project, looking at how poverty impacts on experiences at school. So children tell us about how it feels if you're unable to go on the school trip, unable to participate in the after school activity or the school club because you don't have the money to be able to do that, how it feels like it isolates you, how it singles you out, how it feels like you're not part of things, that you're just, as one said, a spare person. They talk about how they're aware of the lack of funds at home and the inability of their parents to sometimes even buy food for the house. They talk about experiences of being bullied. They also talk about how it feels, they feel they're letting down their class and their peers because they don't have the money to be able to contribute to class activities. So very real day-to-day undermining of the chances of children in their enjoyment of school and wider life. If we go on to the next slide, Hannah. This was a poverty that exists long before the current cost of living crisis. But what we do know is that cost of living crisis is pushing families not just closer to the edge, but too often over the edge. And as one parent said earlier this week at a JRF event, it's not so much a cost of living crisis, it's a cost of surviving crisis for them. They don't feel like they're living, they're just now actually struggling to survive. We know that families with children face energy bills on average 30% higher than other households. The households with children are at greater risk of being pushed into poverty by the current crisis. That despite the energy price guarantee, the average family of four receiving universal credit will still need well over £1,000 over the next months to stay warm and fed. That there's a gap of £1,400 opened up between what they have and what they need to be able to meet those needs. And I suppose what this flags is the importance of all of the child poverty measures that we'll come on and touch on, that we need to look not just at relative child poverty, but at the impact child incomes are having and the current cost of living crisis is having on actual material deprivation that too many children and families are facing. We go on to the next slide. Again, just a few voices from parents in terms of how the cost of living crisis is affecting families, from the JRF report, as I say, published earlier this week, and also from OPFS, published a couple of weeks ago. Where parents just talk about how scary it is, feeling terrified by what's coming and how they're going to be able to pay any more for energy or for food, talking about having to mask how they're feeling to try and avoid unsettling their children because they're just feeling so concerned and stressed about bills, about being unable to sleep at night, about the levels of anxiety that they're facing, and evidence of a significant increase in numbers turning to mental health services to try and support them, and not too often those services not being there. If we go on to the next. I mean, in the face of all this, a key message for us is we just need to remember there's absolutely nothing inevitable about these levels of child poverty. We have seen progress made in the past. So, for example, between the mid-90s and 2010-11, child poverty in Scotland fell by from nearly a third of, or from over a third of children to less than a fifth. 170,000 children pulled out of poverty during that period. That was a result of very real policy interventions at UK, at Scottish and at local level. So the introduction of the national minimum wage, increases to child benefit, improvements in the employability support and childcare available to parents to enable them to take up paid work, improvements in social security and child benefits, and the introduction of tax credits. All of those made a real difference and reduced the numbers of children living in poverty. But of course, we now see a situation where across the UK, poverty has been rising over the last decade, and more worrying still, looks to set to rise further at UK level. with the Resolution Foundation last month modelling an increase to 32%, and that back up to a third of children living in poverty on current economic forecasts and assuming current policies are in place. So progress made, but it can be reversed as well. The more positive story here in Scotland is that we are turning a corner, I think, on child poverty. And that's a result of kind of a consensus and a unanimous support across the parties for the Child Poverty Act introduced in 2017, which set statutory targets to reduce headline measures of child poverty to below 10% by 2030, with an interim target of less than 18% of children living in poverty by 2023-24. Those statutory targets being backed up by the requirement on national government to produce a national child poverty delivery plan and to report to Parliament on that, as well as Hannah will come on and talk a bit more, a duty and on local authorities and their partners to contribute to that action. So that statutory framework has been backed up by very real policies and investment that are making a real impact, and not least the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, that £20 per week for each eligible child under 6 at the moment, but been increased to £25 and rolled out to all children in families in receipt of universal credit and who are under 16 next month. That will and is making a difference to those families and is making a difference to child poverty trends, will do, with the expectation that it should lift in itself around 50,000 children out of poverty across Scotland. That, alongside wider measures to support parents into work and looking at wider trends, suggests that the interim target of reducing child poverty to less than 18% is within reach. But more will be needed, not just at national level, but at local level. And I suppose that's where you all come in, and where the contribution that can be made at local level is really an important part of this. And I think on that note, I pass back to Hannah.
Thanks very much for that, John. I'm just having a bit of trouble getting my next slide to. Here we go. Okay, thank you very much, John. Yeah, as John said, I'm going to pick up where he left off and start talking about the local aspect of this. And as many of you will be aware, the Child Poverty Scotland Act included in section 13 a duty on local authorities and on health boards to produce an annual report, a joint report, highlighting what they've done and what they plan to do in the coming year to tackle child poverty. Although the duty is just on health boards and local authorities, in the majority of local authority areas, these reports tend to be prepared through the community planning partnership and are real, reflect real partnership working to address this the wicked problem of child poverty. So I just want to talk a bit about what we hope will be achieved, what's already being achieved through these local reports, and highlight some things that you might want to look out for in terms of your report and where there might be scope for improvement. So what do we hope they'll achieve? I mean, one of the most important things I think is that these reports are a space to bring about a really sort of laser focus on reducing child poverty. And that might sound quite obvious for child poverty action reports, but it isn't really, because in the first few rounds of reports, we didn't see necessarily that laser focus on reducing child poverty. There was more of a focus, I would say, on measures that might mitigate the impact of child poverty. So there was quite a lot about the literacy gap, for instance, about obesity, about addiction counselling, about things that were seen to be linked to child poverty and that they might mitigate some of the worst impacts, but didn't necessarily impact the drivers of child poverty by increasing income or reducing outgoings. Now, that's not to say those policies and those services aren't worthwhile. They absolutely are. But I think what we're saying is that they shouldn't be the core aspect of local child poverty action reporting. Instead, the focus of that should be on what can we do to increase income, whether that's through employment or social security benefits and reduce outgoings for families. Because as the information that John's presented shows, that poverty, that lack of resource has a massive knock-on impact on children's well-being. So it's one of the most direct ways to influence that well-being is to focus on those drivers and to maximise the resources available to those families. And I think as well as the focus on resources, it's about the focus on child poverty. So we would hope these reports really drive into what are the specific barriers and obstacles that families with children experience, and what are the additional resource implications that come with having children. So to keep that real focus on resources and on children is the sort of value that is brought by this reporting duty. And I mentioned before the importance of focusing on the drivers of poverty, and this diagram, which comes from the Scottish Government, is quite useful in terms of flagging up what the implications of that might be in terms of policy at local level. What might we want to see changed in order to have a sort of direct influence over these drivers and therefore a knock-on impact on rates of child poverty. So if you look, for instance, at income from employment, we might want to think about things like what local authorities and their community planning partners are doing as employers, as anchor institutions that provide employment opportunities. Are they paying a living wage, for example? Are they flexible employment? What are employers, what are they doing through procurement and the contracts they're entering into to raise the quality of employment opportunities in the local area? And that might also be about engaging with private employers. In one area, for instance, the employability team is working with the hospitality sector in the area to support them to create jobs that fit with parents' needs. So to create new shifts that do the lunch shift, for instance, from 10 to 2, Monday to Friday. And that not only helps parents find employment opportunities, it also helps hotels and restaurants retain staff when there are real labour shortages. So looking for these opportunities to create employment that suits with parents' needs. And obviously a big part of that is about childcare and ensuring there's accessible, affordable, flexible childcare that parents can access. The cost of living, and we'll be talking in more detail a bit later on about sort of crisis response to steep increases in the cost of living, but a sort of more long-term level, I think this is about considering housing costs in our areas. Is housing that is suitable for parents and that there are enough bedrooms, that it's close to employment opportunities, that it's close to education? Is that available? Is it being accessed by parents? What might some of the barriers to that be? And the final driver there, income from social security and benefits in kind. There's a few aspects to this that are sort of within local control, or at least local influence. Improving access to income maximisation advice, for instance. So uptake of both UK and national and local benefits is quite variable, and that's partly because of the complexity of the social security system, the fact there's quite a lot of maladministration and error at all levels. So getting access to advice at the right time can be really a game changer for families with children, and we're seeing great examples of putting that advice or access pathways to that advice in places that families frequent. So whether that's within GP practices, whether it's within schools or nurseries, making sure it's really easy to get that advice. And there's also something at local level as well about the generosity of benefits. It may seem like a drop in the ocean when you think about sort of the bigger picture, but local authorities can widen eligibility for benefits such as free school meals. It can increase the generosity of local benefits such as school clothing grants. So there is some scope, there are some levers that can have quite a direct impact on families with children. And excuse me, and the resources available to them. So I think for me, this is just about, it's a long-term focus, as well as the crisis interventions, which are without a doubt essential at the moment. It's thinking about how do we create places that allow parents to access employment, that allow them to be able to afford a decent standard of living. And another thing to consider is who we're trying to reach with these policies. So this slide shows you the priority groups in relation to child poverty. These are the groups that are at highest risk of experiencing child poverty. The vast majority, it's somewhere between 80 and 90%, I think the vast majority of children in Scotland that are living in poverty live in a household that has one or more of these characteristics. So a lone parent household, household in which someone's disabled, minority ethnic households, etc. So we need to be thinking when we're designing policies or services, how can we reassure ourselves that they're reaching these populations? Are we monitoring and evaluating in a way that reassures us of that? Are we taking lived experience into account and considering the particular barriers that these groups might face? And there's great examples, if you look through local child poverty action reports, of interventions that have very much been developed with these households in mind. In Edinburgh, for instance, there are 9 projects specifically focused on employability for parents, and they really go into granular detail looking at the needs of the different groups. So there's a specific programme, for instance, for minority ethnic parents that includes employability skills and English for interviews and that kind of thing. So really being quite specific about the particular needs of the groups that we're trying to reach. So data and intelligence, this is another thing that we would really hope local child poverty action reports are really informed by data and intelligence. And that is, there are quite a lot of challenges to doing that. Firstly, in terms of understanding the scale of child poverty in your area and the location of child poverty in your area, there are various sources that you and officers can draw on in order to understand that. John's already shared a link, and there's a link embedded in this presentation too, to a map highlighting child poverty before housing costs, and that goes down to data zone level. So you can sort of interrogate where child poverty is in your area, but there are sort of serious limitations to the use of this. So there tends to be a lag, sort of 12 to 18 months behind when the data is gathered and when we have access to that information. So there's a time lag. It's also very much income based, doesn't take housing costs into account, doesn't take wider costs into account. And that's a particular issue in rural areas, for instance, where the costs of living are elevated, quite considerably. So it might mask hardship where incomes are relatively strong, but the cost of living is meaning that families can't achieve a sort of basic standard of living. So although these statistics are useful, they don't tell us everything. And I think that's why it's important to consider whether local areas are looking at the data that they have access to through their own services, through employability services, through who's accessing Scottish Welfare Fund, through who's accessing childcare services, and using that to add another layer of richness to your understanding of what need looks like. And a big part of that as well will be the voice of lived experience and people living in your communities and experiencing child poverty in your communities. And as councillors, you're well placed to understand that, because I think the data and the intelligence is really, really important in terms of directing resources and identifying areas that are in need of support. They tell us where the poverty is, but they don't necessarily tell us the why the poverty is there. And if we don't have the why, it's difficult to make sure we're designing the right interventions. So we might see, for instance, that parental employment is really low in an area, but we don't know why. It might be that the transport links just don't allow parents to get their kids to school and nursery and then to get to work and then do pick up on the way home. So it might be a transport issue, and it's difficult to tell that without speaking and co-producing your solutions with parents. The other thing I just want to mention very briefly in relation to data is John mentioned the 4 national targets that exist, and the Scottish Government is tracking Scottish progress towards those targets. The local reporting duty isn't necessarily about tracking local progress towards those targets, partly because the data isn't there to allow us to do that, and partly because there are so many things that are out with local control that will influence those figures. Scottish Government policy, UK Government policy, Ukraine, COVID, all these external factors mean that even if you were doing everything right, using all the levers at your disposal, child poverty might still rise. So what it's about for me is how do we identify indicators that do allow us to show that what we can influence, we are influencing, and that we're reaching those priority families, and that it's potentially having an impact on those drivers. So measuring what we can measure and reassuring ourselves in that way, and not being too distracted by the headline child poverty figures at local level. And finally, I just wanted to talk about the need to ensure that the interventions and the services that we are delivering locally put families at the centre and are designed around their needs. Quite often when you read a local child poverty action report, it reads off like a list of things that different organisations and different departments are delivering at local level. It doesn't read as it doesn't seem strategic, and it doesn't consider how that sort of matrix, that network of services and entitlements feels to often very stressed parents trying to access the basic money that they need, or the basic services that they need to meet their needs. So how can we make this more intuitive? And when we're planning through our local child poverty action reports, make sure we're doing that from the perspective of children and families, not in a disjointed way. So yeah, I think that those are sort of the main points I wanted to make. So I'll hand over to John, who's going to talk a bit more about short-term interventions as opposed to the longer-term interventions that I've been talking about there. If that's all right, John.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Hannah. So yeah, it was just to pick up some of the things Hannah's already been saying in terms of there's obviously a need to respond very immediately to the extraordinary pressures that families with children are facing through the current cost of living crisis. The trick here is to find ways of doing that align with and support those longer term actions that are needed to tackle those drivers of child poverty and to support the effort to reach those national child poverty targets. But in terms of immediate cost of living responses, one of the key things that's become clear, not least from the responses that were made during the COVID crisis in terms of ensuring responding to that crisis, was the importance of taking a cash first approach when looking at how best to get support to families. What's clear is that provision of cash, of money, boosting incomes is what gives parents the choice and the agency to buy what they need for their families at that particular point in time, whether that's energy, food, clothes, paying for a school trip, whatever it is, that it's money that makes it is much easier for them to do that, provides them with dignity, avoids any stigma, enables them to use the same shops, to be able to shop around the cheapest shops, to buy the food that they know their family needs, to meet any dietary needs. So far more effective and a greater impact in terms of children's well-being than approaches that maybe take a food package or a voucher approach to supporting families in crisis. And there are very many examples of really good things going on across local authorities across Scotland. So some local authorities providing additional cash payments, for example, to those entitled to free school meals. Other local authorities increasing existing payments like school clothing grants. So we know that some areas have doubled the value of school clothing grants, increasing them from £150 to £300 for secondary school pupils, for example. We know that local authorities have been using resources to put additional money into the Scottish Welfare Fund so that it has the resources it needs to respond to families in crisis and be able to pay more crisis grants to families, but also the importance of raising awareness of that fund to ensure that families are aware it exists and removing barriers to accessing it. Have put money into their discretionary housing payment budgets as well to ensure that the gap between UK Social Security support for housing costs and actual housing costs is bridged for those families unable to pay their rent, or not without enough money to pay rent. But also, as well as actually finding ways of getting additional cash payments to families, supporting families to maximise their incomes through other sources as well. And Hannah's already flagged the importance of advice services, but also the importance of ensuring that there's active referrals from into advice services and beyond to other support services. And this whole idea of taking a no wrong door approach, so that wherever a struggling family presents to a local authority or to its partners, that opens up a gateway not just to immediate crisis support and cash support, not just to income maximisation advice, but to the other supports that might be available in terms of supporting that family to increase their earnings through work, to manage debts, to reduce the costs that they face. And on that final point of reducing cost, another area where local authorities can really play a role is actually reducing the costs that families face. Taking a more forgiving approach to debts that owed to the council, particularly council tax debts, school meal debts, rent arrears, where families have no money and are facing acute income pressures, pursuing them for debts that may be owed to the council that they can't actually afford to pay is not just counterproductive, but risks pushing them into even further crisis, with building up further costs for councils and other public services in the future. We know there's work that can be done to reduce cost of transport, and we have now free bus travel for under 22s, but we also know there's a huge variation across Scotland in terms of the numbers of children who have actually got their free bus pass. So work that can be done there to ensure that all children, and particularly those on lower income families, have got that bus pass. And finally, work can be done, and it's a work that we at CPAG are supporting councils across Scotland and individual schools as well, to reduce the cost of the school day, reduce the cost of school uniform, of school trips, of school activities, of school materials, so that we're not burdening families with even more costs at a time where their incomes are under extreme stress. So all of those are approaches that kind of focus in on improving incomes in the very short term to support families through their current crisis, but can also help to underpin and support those longer term actions that are needed if we're serious about seriously reducing child poverty into the future. And all that, I'll hand back to Hannah.
Thanks very much for that, John. I'm just having trouble with these slides again. Hold on. Okay. Thanks very much for that, John. So I'm just going to very quickly reiterate a few of the key messages that I think John and I have already touched on most of these before we sort of open up for responses and for questions. So yeah, firstly, seek to ensure investment is adequate. That's probably quite a self-evident one, but I think there's no question of the importance of this agenda, both for families with children, but also for our communities and for our local economies. It's spending now to support families does make savings going forward, so it's really worth ensuring that the adequate resources are found. And I think considering that that's not just in relation to crisis payments and support through the cost of living crisis, although again that's vital, but considering when we're looking at the wider budget in terms of what is spent on housing and transport, considering those spending decisions from a child poverty perspective, and considering whether the gains through that spending is falling to families with children, in particular those priority groups. Seeking to ensure a cash first dignified approach. I think John's already gone into a fair bit of detail on that. Thirdly, leadership, the importance of being a champion for child poverty. Some councils have a portfolio lead for child poverty or have established committees around child poverty to make sure that this doesn't fall off the agenda. It's something that needs to be considered all the time. And, you know, when you look at that driver diagram, looking at all the different portfolios and policy areas that are relevant to this, you know, there really needs to be a constant consideration and people constantly looking at those policies through the prism of child poverty. So fourthly, to scrutinise your local child poverty report and consider whether a long-term preventative approach is being taken, the priority groups, and whether interventions are informed by evidence. And then listening to your constituents and their experiences of living in poverty in your constituency, and finding ways to make sure that testimony is acted upon and is informing action at local level. Another important aspect of this is the Fairer Scotland duty. So that is where strategic decisions are being made. There is a legal duty to consider whether, the impact that will have on socioeconomic inequality. Child poverty is obviously a big part of that, and it's an important tool to make sure that every single important decision being made is considered from that perspective, and that we're asking questions like, how will this decision help protect and increase family incomes or reduce the costs that families face? So to keep that that lens on all the decisions that are being made. John, is there anything you'd want to add to that before we open up for questions?
Not really. I don't think. I think the key thing is here that there's a huge range of ways in which councils can and already are providing very important support to families in the current crisis, and the trick is to do that in a way that underpins and supports and aligns with those longer term actions that are needed to tackle the drivers of child poverty. So focusing on increasing incomes, focusing on reducing costs, and if we can get that now, I think both supports families in the immediate sense, but also supports that longer term work that's needed to genuinely see us meet those child poverty targets.